Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to our webinar today for administrators. This is sponsored by TLCC and Ytria, and my name is Howard Greenberg with TLCC. And joining me as host today is Rob Evangelista from TLCC. Rob, why don't you say hello?
Hi, everybody.
Oh, thanks, Rob. And we're going to be your host today for this webinar. First, a bit about TLCC. Some of you may be familiar with us from our X-Pages webinars. We've been doing those for a number of years. And this is actually the first webinar we've done for admins. And for that, we're partnering with Ytria. And we might continue this as a series. So if you would like to see that, let us know, and let us know what topics you might want to see, and we'll take that into consideration. A little bit about TLCC. We've been around for quite a while. We actually opened and started in 1997 doing notes and domino training. We do self-paced distance learning courses for both developers, admins, and users. For notes and domino, that's all we do. We specialize in just notes and domino. We also do on-site private classes and on-site, or not on-site, but online private classes that are instructor-led, in addition to our self-paced courses. And we do mentoring and consulting as well. And we have a couple of courses that are very popular, mostly because they're free, Introduction to X-Pages Development and Application Development 1, which is a great way to see how a TLCC course works. As far as administration courses, we have courses for both 8.5 and 9, as well as old version. For new developers, we have a System Administration 1 and 2 courses. And for those of you who are transitioning to, let's say, Notes and Domino 9, we have a System Administration Update that covers all the new things in Notes and Domino 9. It gives you a good overview of the features, as well as will prepare you for the update certification exam. So you can get some more information on that at our website. A little bit about asking questions. We're going to hold off on all the questions until the end. However, I encourage you, as we go through this webinar, to please ask your questions as they come up. And to do that, in the WebEx interface, you'll have a Q&A pane. And open that up, and you can ask the questions. Don't choose a person, but ask it of all panelists, and put your question in the Q&A pane. Please note that we will not be monitoring the chat. So don't put your questions in the chat. Put them in the Q&A pane. And Rob and I will take your questions, and we will ask the questions of both Ben and Kim at the end of the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will send out an email with a link to the recording, as well as a link to the slides that are being used today. So our two presenters are both very experienced presenters who presented at Connect multiple times, as well as many of the other user groups around the world. We have Ben Menesi, who's the Chief Product Officer from Ytria, and Kim Greene, who will kick off the webinar. Kim is not only an expert on Notes and Domino, but also on Notes and Domino running on iSeries. So Kim, why don't you take it away?
Great, thank you very much, Howard. Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here and have Ben actually get we need to have the presentation actually handed over to Ben, because he's actually going to handling the controls. So if you can go ahead and do that, Howard, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go and get started. This presentation that Ben and I have created, we both do a lot of work with replication, obviously with Ben with Ytria, with all the work that they do with the Replication Easy product. And with my company, we do a lot of consulting services around replication. So hopefully by the end of this, you're going to go from being frustrated with replication to fascinated. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll go ahead and introduce myself. A little bit of background about myself. I actually started my career at IBM Rochester, which is home of the AS400 iSeries. That's actually why I have an affiliation with that hardware platform. I worked in the operating system, actually in performance, multiple areas of operating system performance, and then I moved to Partner World for developers, starting working with the Lotus Domino product, absolutely loved what I did. So I left about a little over 14 years ago now and started my own consulting company. And you can see that we provide a wide variety of consulting services. And basically what we are is an extension of the IT department. So it's kind of funny when I talk to a lot of my friends that work in the support organization, we talk about different things that come across their desks and different things that we work on. They say, you know, you really do get a lot of really weird things. And actually, to me, that's one of the fun things of it. We do a lot of the heavy lifting. So a lot of the customer examples you're going to see in the presentation actually have come out of the consulting services that we offer. So enough about myself. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ben and let him introduce himself.
All right, thank you, Kim, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this very first TLCC Ytria webinar. That will be about replication. My name is Ben Menesi, and I work with Ytria, where what we do is we help Domino administrators and developers with their daily jobs with our Easy Suite Complete product portfolio. A little bit about my background as well. I started out in administration, but I ended up doing a lot of administration and development for numerous enterprise IBM customers, even before I joined Ytria. Ever since that, I'm basically focusing on product management, and this is where the Replication Easy product came up. Now, I would like to do a very brief introduction of who we are and where we come from as a company for those of you who do not know us. Ytria is an advanced IBM business partner founded and headquartered in Montreal, Canada. And what we do is we develop tools for Domino admins and developers. That is all that we do. We do not even have any services department. So we've got about 10 developers full-time focused on building and making these tools better. Now, why we thought about doing this presentation in the first place was because we released a product regarding replication that works with replication issues in September 2012. And the idea was to make this product something like a Swiss Army knife for dealing with replication problems and pretty much everything you need to deal with when it comes to replication. Now, I promise that this is not going to be a sales session, so we're going to definitely focus on a lot of deep stuff, a lot of details. And with that said, I am going to talk a little bit about the agenda. So what we've got to cover today is actually a lot. We've got over 95 slides in this slide deck, so we actually had to go ahead and hide some of the slides, but this is all going to be available in the slide deck afterwards. We're going to get started with a very brief introduction to replication. We're going to cover some of the aspects of working with the replicator, server task, connection documents, even cluster replication. And then we're going to go into the really deep stuff where we're going to look at what exactly happens when two databases replicate. We're going to talk a little bit about security considerations, selective replication, replicating subsets of documents. We're going to move on to comparing documents, what actually happens when two documents are compared, and we're going to do all of this with a whole lot of customer scenarios. We've been doing this presentation with Kim for about a year and a half now, and it's interesting how it evolves with time, and we get more and more customer stories and questions. So this is what we're going to share with you today. So we're going to get started with the introduction part, and let's take a look at the replication-related tasks. On to you, Kim.
Great, thank you, Ben. Just took just a minute there for the slide to come through. So when we look at the replication-related tasks, basically we have two that we need to be concerned with. You'll see replica and CL-REPL. CL-REPL is the one that just runs continuously in the background, and that's basically doing the cluster replication, streaming cluster replication functionality. And Ben's going to be talking about that in a little bit. The other one is the replica task. And this is actually, if you're not using clustering, then you're going to have replica involved. You'll have it involved whether you have clustering or not. So this is basically anytime you're setting up a connection document and saying, I want to tell the replicator it's going to replicate every 90 minutes, for example. This is the actual task that goes ahead and takes care of doing that for you. So you can think of the connection document as the brain. It's actually telling replica, hey, now is when I actually want you to do your work. Here's how long I actually want you to run. And so the replica is actually the muscle actually going in and doing the work. One of the things I'd recommend is keeping an eye on your replicator queues and seeing if your queue depth is getting too long. If it is, you need to actually go in and load an additional replicator. You can simply do that at the console by doing load replica, or go ahead and just add in the replicators and equals and your notes initialization file. Now let's go ahead and take a look at connection documents. Because again, this is basically the brains behind the muscle telling the replica task when it needs to actually do its work. What you're going to see here on the basics tabs, we actually have our source server, and then on the right side, we actually have the destination server. And the critical thing to understand here is the source server is actually the one that's going to be doing the work. So you can see here in this particular case, we have DOM test 1 is going to be replicating to DOM test 3. And DOM test 1 is the one that's actually going to be doing the work. So it's going to be doing the pull or the push or the pull-push, whichever way you set up your replication. And the critical thing is not only does your connection document control replication, but also mail routing. And also, when you're looking at replication, it allows you to specify which specific individual databases you want to replicate or whole folders, or maybe you don't want to replicate. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next tab, which is our replication and routing tab. Here you can see that we have a pull-push replication, which is the default type you're going to get. And you see that the files and directories are the paths as far as what we're going to replicate. We have our 3 critical databases. We have admin 4, events 4, names.nsf, and you're all replicating those throughout your domain, right? Hopefully you say yes. It is very, very critical. Those are the 3 critical databases you need to be really looking at and making sure they're properly replicating through your domain. Others, you could end up with some really interesting replication issues. I think one of the critical parameters here that customers tend to typically overlook is you also can specify the files or directory paths that you do not want to replicate. So here you can see we have DB to not replicate specified. This is maybe where you want to put some templates in that you maybe don't want to replicate because you're doing some work on them, or just make sure that you really look at what you have in what's going to be replicating and what's not going to be replicating. And then the parameter in the very bottom here is the replication time limit. This is something that we find that a lot of customers, they typically don't even fill out. They don't actually understand how it comes into play. Let's say that by default you set up your replication and you're on your schedule tab, and you say that you're going to replicate every 60 minutes. You'd want to set your replication time limit to something less than 60 minutes. So you might want to set it to 59 minutes or 50 minutes, just so that you basically end up having a much healthier replication topology when you do specify the replication time limit to a slightly lesser value than what your repeat interval in your schedule is.
All right. There is actually an interesting aspect of working with connection documents, and this is something that we do a lot at Ytria. Is as having worked with administration, the way we did is we feel like there's a lot of areas in Dynamo where you just do not have a global overview that you should have. Like, this is one of the things that I believe is true for connection documents, and really understanding how connection documents are set up in your environment. When you look at a view in your names and address book, all that you're going to see is the list of connection documents in there. And if I would ask you what your names.nsf is supposed to be up to, or how a certain database is supposed to be replicating, it is a very hard question to answer just by looking at that specific view. So there is a small trick to perform here, which is that you can create a new copy of your server/connections view, which basically contains your connection documents, and add a new column on the left-hand side, which is going to be a categorized column that will display the file names item, and thereby it will let you look at your connection documents by the actual databases that they contain, so that you can better understand what these databases should be doing with the replicator server task. Now, this solution, of course, will not allow you to understand how this comes together with some wildcards that you may have set up. So this is where you can also work with some third-party tools like our Replication Easy tool, which will actually take that into consideration as well and give you a graphical layout, a graphical representation of how these databases are supposed to be replicating in your environment. There is a very interesting scenario that we ran onto with a customer, which was about a couple months ago, actually, that actually points out the importance of setting up your replication correctly. So what this customer was doing is they were a shipping company, and they had about 40 servers, but 38 of those servers were located on their ships and replicating through the satellite. right? And this is where you really need to pay attention to optimizing your bandwidth usage. So what we found is we actually have a product that actually inside Replication Easy, there's a tool that allows us to track how a given database has been replicating. And what we do essentially is that we go into the replication history and we use the replication history entries as pointers to find any other replicas and then go into their replication histories. And this is how we can really understand how replication happened. Now, we have to go into this customer's environment, and I have to say I love deploying Replication Easy in production environments. What we found looking at one of their business applications is that it was essentially replicating with each and every server in that environment. Now, this is where what we looked at and what we've seen was that pretty much if replication was set up correctly, they could have probably saved about 95% of the bandwidth costs that they were paying for because of replicating through satellite. Now, just so you see how this actually looks like in a graphical representation, this is what we saw. You can see that this is not exactly the standard hub and spoke replication topology. As a matter of fact, it's not even replication topology. It is actually what happened. So this is something very interesting to look at. And the next thing that we examined in this customer environment was, why is this happening, right? And what we found with our connection document analyzer tool was that basically it was not only this business critical application, but pretty much every other application that those servers had in common that were replicating like this, because most of their connection documents specified all databases instead of just taking the ones that are really important. So this is where I think this tool just paid for itself right away, and it's very interesting to see how it actually shows you stuff that you can't really see otherwise. So that is about connection documents. Now, as far as cluster replication, there is more, but we have to just hide a few slides here. One of the things that's important to understand is that clustering is in-memory replication. This means that when changes occur, they're queued to the cluster replicator and will be sent to the cluster servers immediately. This actually has a downside because if one of those servers goes down, these changes are going to be lost when it comes up. So this is where it's advised to use traditional replication as a backup, to have some sort of some connection documents that make sure that you're going to replicate those, say, every 360 minutes. Streaming cluster replication is what was introduced in Domino 8, and it is an enhanced version of cluster replication. Again, this is event drive, and changes are pushed to those cluster mates as they happen immediately. There's an interesting trick that we use in our products every now and then, and I use it as a developer myself, is to use the NSPing server API call. Instead of using this traditional way of pinging a given server by declaring a specific database and seeing if the handle exists or not, this API call is going to be 3 times as fast in telling us whether that server is available or not, according to our testing, and it's also going to tell us whether the server is busy, whether it's been restricted, which as far as I know, there is no way to really know from the outside if it was set to be restricted by the administrator. It's going to tell us the availability index for the server, as well as give us a list of all of the cluster mates and the cluster name that this server belongs to. So this is just a small tip to be aware of. This is something that helped us enormously. All right, so with that, we're actually through the first part, but this is where we get to the real deep stuff. We're going to take a look at what actually happens when databases replicate. We're going to get started with what access considerations we need to be aware of. Then we're going to take a look at some replication history things, understand how the replication history plays a role in what happens. Then we're going to go on to understand how the list of documents is going to be prepared that are going to be compared between replicas. Then we move on to how to replicate subsets of documents using selection formulas or readers fields, and then go into the real stuff to understand what happens when 2 documents are compared. How does the replicator engine decide what happens, whether that's an update, a create, or delete? And then we're going to wrap things up with what can go wrong, which, as you might be guessing, is a lot of things, right? So, Kim, why don't we get started with the first thing and take a look at what we need to be aware of as far as access considerations.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Ben. So again, you have to have access, and the 2 things that come into play, the main 2 things that come into play here is you have to have access at the server level. And where this is actually controlled is actually in the security section of your server document. And the 2 critical fields you want to look at is access server and create new replicas. One of the things that you'll find, and when you start looking at access servers, some customers may have it selected so that the option trust users, all users listed in this trusted directory are selected, which is more secure than just leaving it at the default setting. If you do have that selected, make sure whatever you do, whatever servers are going to be replicating in your domain, make sure that those are explicitly listed. One of the better things to do instead of explicitly listing the servers is just to add in the group local domain servers. And this is something you really want to consider doing because it's very easy to add in a new server and forget about it. And then all of a sudden you have replication problems. You're wondering, why in the world can this server not replicate? All of my other servers are replicating fine. Well, you go into the security access section of the server document and you find out that server's not listed. So the better thing to do is just put in local domain servers. So that's making sure that the servers have appropriate access to each other to actually even be able to begin starting to work with replication. The next thing is looking at who can create replicas. Obviously, if you're using the administration process to create a replica, you want to make sure that the local domain servers, again, is listed in this particular parameter, and then obviously any of your administrators, your developers that would actually be needing to create replicas. So that's at the server level, but also you have to once you get to the server, you have to make sure that the servers have the appropriate access to the databases that they're going to be replicating. So make sure that you look at your access control list settings for your databases that you're going to be replicating. Just a couple of tips related to your replication, or basically looking at, say, your access for replication. If you're in a situation where you're not allowed to, you're not in the field in this server document in the security section to say that you can create replicas, one of the ways you can actually get around that, you can actually just create a new database, just create an empty database, and then go ahead and once you've created that database, just change this replica ID to the replica ID that needs to be, and then let replication do its magic. So that's one tip to get around that particular situation you may run into. Another tip, if you have a very large database that you need to manually replicate and you don't want to have your notes client be tied up for a long time, one of the things you can do to very quickly get that replica stub out on the server is just create a fake replication formula. Go ahead and replicate, and obviously no documents will be transferred. Once that replica stub is out, then you can go ahead and just use the replicate task on the server, and it's going to go ahead and synchronize the database for you. Now, this last tip is something, it's a tip, but it's also kind of a gotcha, something to be aware of. This is something I actually find very invaluable. I use it quite often. If you have two servers, it's very common on the IBMI platform to have multiple domino servers on the same physical box or same physical LPAR. Instead of actually having to use admin P to create a new replica of a database on a new server, you can actually use the CP command. One of the things you need to be aware of, it's extremely powerful. It's great that you can do this, but it does actually override note security. So just make sure you understand that you need to lock down who has access to that command as well. So let's go ahead and let's delve into replication history now that we actually looked at our access rights. And when we're looking at the replication history, we have to keep in mind what's happening here. And we have to look at who the source server is. So in this particular case, our source server is always going to be server A. In the first scenario, we're doing a push. The second scenario, we're doing a pull. And the third scenario, we're doing a pull-push. What's really critical is actually understanding what replication history is being checked, which particular databases it's being checked on. In the first scenario where server A is going to be pushing to server B, it needs to determine, hey, I'm going to be pushing changes over to server B, so I better look at what the replication history is in the database that's local to me. So it's going to look at that local replication history. It's going to push the appropriate documents over to the database on server B. The exact opposite happens in a pull scenario. In this case, again, server A is doing all the work. It's going to be pulling from server B. So what it needs to do is it needs to look and say, hey, I need to look at the replication history. Which documents have changed since the last time I did a pull from this particular database on server B? And obviously in a pull-push scenario, both of those have to be looked at. So what happens if there happens to be no replication history or it happens to be disregarded? In that particular scenario, what ends up happening is every single document has to be looked at. So you have a situation where you don't have any replication history. This takes longer, but it is a much cleaner replication. So it's something that you need to be aware of. It's a much cleaner replication. What you may be asking yourself, when would replication history actually be disregarded? Well, it's disregarded in two different scenarios. The first is if the access rights have changed. Obviously, security has changed. For example, a server no longer has access to a certain set of documents or no longer has access to, you've put in a replication formula. that changes which documents are actually going to be replicated, then it has to actually disregard the replication history and start over. So a couple of things that you need to watch out for. What if you have this scenario where you have a local database that's replicating with a database that's on the server? In that scenario, when you look at the replication history on the server, you're not actually going to see any replication history. This is something to be aware of. The replication history for that will be on the local database, but you're not going to see a trace of that on the server. And then you may have a scenario where you have somebody saying, hey, wait a minute, I know my database, I can look on my replication settings, I know that I replicate every 5 minutes, but when I look at my replication history, it says this database hasn't replicated in over 1.5 hours. What's going on? Well, don't panic. Replication is actually happening. What the trick here is you're actually not going to see the replication history until you actually until there's actually a change that's happened. So in this particular scenario, unless there's actually a change that happened, there won't be any replication history. So that's very, very normal. So don't panic. And at this, now that we've actually looked at our access rights, we looked at our check replication history, let's go ahead and look at what happens when we actually go to build a list of documents that we're going to process. This is actually really, really critical to understand. This readers fields, this is something that's used very often in applications, but keep in mind that basic note security applies. So what this means, if you have a scenario where you're using readers fields, you need to make sure that all the servers that are going to be replicating with that database and need to actually replicate those documents need to be listed in that readers field. If it's not listed in the readers field, then there isn't any way that that server has access to that document, and therefore you're going to render yourself, you're going to actually find out there's a problem. And let's go ahead and we'll take a look at a customer example here. So this is a customer of ours. They have 2 servers in their cluster, and they have a security-based application. It's basically an application that contains all of their passwords. And they work, obviously, off of their primary server, and that's where they normally work. So they had a situation where they had to take their primary server down, and they failed over, like they should, in a clustered environment to their secondary server. And what they realized is they started looking, not all the documents were there, and they were trying to figure out what happened. So when they had, they did some analysis on their own, brought their primary server back up. They obviously, it was planned outage that they had, so they could easily come back to their primary server, and all the documents were there. They started doing some looking around, and they said, well, we see some of the newer documents, but we actually don't understand why. So they called us and they said, can you go ahead and take a look? So we actually dug in, and one of the things that we found is that in looking at the application, someone actually had gone in about 2 months prior, and they had actually changed the form, and they added in a readers field. So when we started looking at the document properties, we could actually see that the primary server was listed in the readers field, but the secondary server wasn't. So this is another scenario where it's really good to put in local domain servers rather than listing explicit servers, because it's really easy to forget to add in all your appropriate servers. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Ben, and he's going to talk about applying selection formulas. So take it away, Ben.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what else we can use in addition to the readers fields that we talked about. So we can use selective replication formulas that are basically the other way to replicate only a subset of your database content. We actually have an interesting use case for this where we wouldn't want to use readers fields to decide what's being replicated and what isn't, where we've got 3 replicas of the same database on the same server, which is not a best practice scenario per se, but basically we're replicating a CRM application to 3 different partners, and the only way for us to really make sure that we only replicate the appropriate partner documents into those replicas is to set up these selective replication formulas. Now, what the problem with selective replication formulas is that they're really, really hard to oversee. I've actually talked to administrators who told me, look, this is a database level setting. It's not a big deal. But the thing is, it's not a database level thing. It's something that will allow you to set up as many different scenarios as you want to. And there is going to be a few rules that you need to be aware of to really set it up correctly. So let's take a look at how to set it up correctly. Basically, if I want to define what happens when I receive documents in replica B, so we're talking about 2 different servers, in replica B, I want to set up what happens when I receive something from A. I'm going to set up a replication formula that says the receiver is B and the sender is A, and in this case, I want to apply a certain formula. I only want to replicate a subset of documents. This is the way to set it up and not the other way around. We're going to look at the incorrect settings here, but this is what we're talking about here. So if I set up another selective replication formula, which is going to be the default selective replication formula for whatever happens when replica B receives something from somewhere, this is what I'm showing right here as the receives from says any server. We think that this general rule will always apply, but this is not true. Because if we receive something from our replica A, in this scenario, because there is a setting specifically for the A to B scenario, this is going to override the general rule, and that is something to be aware of here. So this is a correct setting up of selective replication formulas. What is not correct to set up this way is if I set up what should happen when the replica A receives something from replica B, and I want to do this on replica B. Because the thing is, when we do that, if we do not replicate this selective replication formula, this is not going to work because we need to set this up on replica A to say what is going to happen when this replica receives from replica B. Why it is kind of a tricky thing to do is because when we set up selective replication formulas, they are by default set not to replicate. This is why it's critical to make sure that the receiver field is not changed, and you just set it up on the databases that are actually playing the receiver end in the scenario. Now, another question that's also important to mention is, do replication formulas, selective replication formulas, always take effect? The answer to that is no. The reason why not is because, for example, cluster replication will disregard them. And that is because cluster replication's #1 target is to make sure that the database that is taking part in cluster replication is going to have identical replicas should any users fail over, which is kind of the point. Another thing to know is that you should not be using selective replication formulas on databases that are set to take part in cluster replication, or even better, you should not make those databases take part in cluster replication when they have some selective replication formulas, because the thing is, scheduled replication will actually consider those selective replication formulas, and it will recalculate the contents of databases when replicating, but then after that, cluster replication kicks in, and it's going to disregard it and make sure the databases are identical, which essentially results in confusion and increased processing times, not to mention the view index updates. Now, Kim actually has a great example here that we looked at together. Why don't I pass it over to you?
Great, thanks, Ben. This is a customer of mine. They have 3 servers in their cluster, actually. And in this case, they have a primary server that people work off of, and they have 2 backup servers. Their particular employees, a lot of their employees end up in quite remote scenario, or quite remote locations, I should say. So a lot of times they end up in low bandwidth scenarios, and what they'll end up with is, so they'll end up working off of a local replica. And in this particular case, the customer called and they said, we're trying to figure this out. We have the user, they're creating their documents, obviously in their local replica, and everything looks fine. But when they looked at the primary replica, the replica on the primary server, they weren't seeing the documents there. So they said, can you please investigate and help us out and figure out what's going on? So one of the first things we did is we said, okay, let's verify that the documents are certainly, we're seeing them in the user's local replica. Sure enough, they were there. And we weren't seeing them either in the primary, the replica on the primary server. But what was really interesting is we actually were seeing the replicas on the 2 backup servers. So we did some investigation, and what we actually found is that someone had inadvertently, and it was a complete accident, they had gone into the replica on the primary server, and they put in a selection formula. So once we discovered that, we were able to go ahead and take out that selection formula, and sure enough, the replication problem had resolved itself. So very simple to fix, but it took a little bit of digging to go ahead and get into that one. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Ben, and he's going to talk about the details that are involved when we start comparing documents.
All right, excellent. We will actually go through some of the important identifiers and properties of documents and notes in a specific notes database before we go into the actual comparison scenarios. So obviously there is the very basic information here as far as the universal ID and note ID go. So there is going to be the document universal ID that is a 16-byte identifier that is responsible for uniquely identifying documents across multiple replicas. This is how we know how to compare compare that list of documents that are going to be compared during replication in databases. This can be queried using the add document unique ID in formulas and the note document class's universal ID property in Lotus script. And then there is the note ID, which is essentially, it's a smaller in size identifier, which is why this is going to be the one that is used in individual databases. And so this identifies documents in one database at the time, but you're going to see that documents with the same universal ID across different replicas will have different note IDs. This is going to be you can query this using the @note ID in formulas and the note ID property of the notes document class in Lotus script. Now, we're going to move on to some pretty exciting stuff here. Let's take a look at sequence numbers. This is something we actually talked to a lot of customers as Ytria and with Kim together as well. And what we found is that sometimes not even developers or administrators are aware of how the sequence number thing works. So essentially, there is a sequence number for each document and a note, as a matter of fact. So when I say note, that is either a document or a design or any kind of entity in a notes database. Sequence number will be something that is increased every time the document is saved, and this is what will be very heavily used by the replicator engine to decide who's going to win replication and how. We're going to get to this later. What's interesting is that both documents and items on those documents have sequence numbers, and the document sequence number is pretty much going to be the highest item level sequence number. So when you look at a backend document, in, for example, ScanEasy, you will see a list of the items in the document, and you will see that the highest item level sequence number is pretty much going to be the same as the document sequence number. Looking at the item sequence numbers can give you a good indication of which items are being updated frequently. Now, how do you get the sequence number information from documents? You can either use the @element formula to look at the $revisions field, but the thing is this can be a little bit risky because the $revisions item, and we're going to talk about this a bit later, the $revisions item will be limited at 500 entries by default, but you can also set up a database level limit here, which means there's not going to be any more entries, for example, by default than 500 entries. So if you save the document more than that, it's not going to actually give you the sequence number. You can also use the NSF node get info API call to gather the sequence number parts of the return header info, or you can use ScanEasy or I believe maybe even NoteSpeak to gather this information. Now, oh, there is a great scenario. I'm sorry, I forgot about this one. This is great that happened to Kim and has to do with sequence numbers. So why don't you walk us through this one?
Sure. This is a really interesting scenario. We had one of my customers, they called and they said, we have this strange scenario happening where every morning we look at the document and we look at this particular field and the field has been reset and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And they would go and they would check the document all throughout the day, and sure enough, the field would stay exactly the way it needed to be, would be completely perfect. And they'd check it right before they went home, and what was really interesting is they took a screen capture, because they use the Ytria tools, and they had ScanEasy, so they took a screen capture, which was really perfect. So they sent that information to me, and sure enough, they called the next morning, and they said, yep, it's been reset back. So I went ahead and started looking and doing some analysis, and what I found is basically there was a rogue agent that was going in every night at 9 p.m. and actually making an update to the document, so it was easy enough to fix. But what was really interesting, when I started looking at it, I had the screen capture that the customer had sent to me from the night prior, and the item sequence number was 241. But then I looked in the next morning, and it was the item sequence number was 2. And so I called Ben, and I said, hey, have you seen this before? This is really interesting. And so he actually did some testing. And I'll let him talk about the testing that he did, which is really very, very interesting.
Yeah, so basically what happened is we wrote an agent to blow up that document, so to speak, so save it as many times as we wanted to. And what we found was that although the document level sequence number increased during the night, right, but the item level sequence number was reset, as it turns out, because item level sequence numbers reset after 256 automatically. And it's similar to the $revisions item, as a matter of fact. So this is something that was really interesting. That's what our inner geeks really like about investigations like that. All right. So we're going to move on with the $revisions and the $updated by items, which are very important when it comes to investigating replication problems. Let's start with the $revisions. This is a standard document field in the backend. Essentially, it's going to contain 8-byte entries for each time the document was saved. So these entries are going to be date stamps that tell us when exactly the document was saved. And the database level limit, as we discussed, is going to be 500 entries. The interesting thing is I just did a test about this today, is when we hit that limit, automatically the 50 oldest entries are going to be removed from the $revisions item. So this is something really interesting to be aware of. Now, the $updated by item is in some ways similar, in some ways a little bit different from the $revisions. The $updated by item is going to contain the canonical names that are about 40 bytes for each user who saved the document. The first entry in this item is going to be the creator of the document, but then again, there is a way to limit this for the NETS database, and when you hit that limit, the oldest entry is going to be removed, and so if you hit that limit and use the created by property of this document, that is actually going to look at the $updated by field's most old value. So it's not going to be accurate anymore. This is why it is advised to create a composed when created field to identify the creator of this document. Now, what's important to understand is that this field is actually going to not be in sync with the $revisions, because the thing is, when I save this document 3 times, I will only have 1 entry in the $updated by field, while we generate 3 date stamps in the $revisions, which is why in this particular scenario that we're looking at here, we have no way to know which of those 3 users saved the document 2 times. Okay, so that's something important to understand here. Now, let's move on to something else that's also very interesting. So there's creation, modification, and deletion dates, right, for each document. Now, what's interesting to know about, and very important too, is that all of these date stamps, but let's just talk about the creation date. All of these date stamps will have 2 different dates. As far as the creation goes, there's going to be a created initially date, and there's going to be a created in this file or edit in this file date. Basically, what's important is that when you use the @created in formulas or the notes documents created property in Lotus script, the initial creation date, which is the birth date of that document, is going to be returned. But the added in this file date is going to tell us when that document was replicated into this replica. So what's important about these is that when you look at the difference between the initial creation and the added in this file dates, you will, with that difference, you will get how long it took to replicate that document into this replica. And we're going to get back to this later because this can be very important when it comes to resolving ghost and resurrected documents. This value is actually very tricky. You can see it on the properties window for documents, but otherwise the only way to get this is using the C API and an API call actually. Now there's an interesting scenario here that Kim just ran into. I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So why don't you walk us through that, Kim?
Okay, certainly. The scenario that we had is we had one of our customers, they were having some really strange replication issues with their administration database, their admin4.nsf database. And we started doing some investigation, and we found that there were documents, some that were missing from some of the different server replicas, and some that actually were completely, that were duplicated. So we had some that were missing, some that were duplicated was a scenario, and we started looking and digging in. And remember what Ben just talked about. So we started looking at the fields. They created initially and added in this file. And so created initially is obviously when the document was created. So here we can see the document was created at 9:12:48 a.m. Added in this file was when it was replicated into this particular replica. Well, look at this, 9:12:38. How can it be that added in this file when it actually was replicated in this file was actually 10 seconds before it was actually created? So that's obviously keyed us off to the fact that the times probably were different. So one of the things that we did is we looked at what are the times actually, the times on the physical systems. And what we found is that the two LPARs, these happen to be IBMI servers, two LPARs were actually getting their time from themselves. They weren't getting it from a coordinated time server. So this is a really very, very important tip to remember when you're working with replication, whether you're using clustering or just replicating from server to server, any of the servers that are involved in replication, make sure that they're getting their time from the exact same time server. One of the things that's really nice is a quick fix. It was a really easy thing to reset the time, because as soon as you change the time on the server, the Domino server picks it up immediately. So that was actually really, really good to get fixed, but this can cause big issues in your replication if you're not careful. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Ben's taking you through all the anatomy of the document. What are all the different parts and pieces that are involved as far as comparing documents? Obviously, one of the things we also have to take into consideration are deletion stubs. So a deletion stub is created anytime a document is deleted from a database. And you would just think of it as a light placeholder that contains basic information about that document. And it does contain literally basic information. All of the item values are gone. You can see that all that remains are 4 items, the document unique ID, and again, this has been covered. This is a unique ID that lets us identify that document across every single replica, the initial creation time, and then when it was deleted, both initially and then in this file, when it replicated in this file, and the sequence number. Again, that sequence number is extremely important. We also have another type of deletion stub, so to speak. When we have soft deletions enabled in a database, we obviously, if we delete a document, it goes into the trash folder. It's going to stay in there for the 48 hours or however many hours we determine they need to stay in the trash folder before they're permanently deleted. When they're in this interim state, when they're a soft deletion, obviously we have a deletion stub that contains those four basic pieces of information, but we still have all the different items as well, so we can see what the contents of that particular document is. So if we take a look at deletion stubs, well, how long are they actually kept in a database? And the answer, like anything, if you think about anything performance related, it depends. And the same thing depends for deletion stubs. By default, if you create a brand new database, the default will be 90 days. But what you need to do is you need to go into your replication settings, go to the Space Savers tab and actually see what it's set to. And here you can see that it happens to be set to the default of 90. It may be set to 7, 21. It really depends on the specific database. But what's probably not overly obvious is that this is the field that determines how long those deletion stubs are going to stay in the database. Well, kind of. The other thing that is you have to take into consideration is the deletion stubs get purged on a regular basis. And the regular basis is 1/3 of that particular value. So in this case, 1/3 of 90 is 30 days. So every 90 days, those deletion stubs are going to be purged. So that means you can have a scenario where you may have deletion stubs that are actually older than 90 days. So in this particular case, you could have deletion stubs that are potentially 119 days old. So just an information to be aware of. And so let's go ahead and take a look at a customer scenario related to deletion stubs. I had a customer they have 2 servers in their cluster, and they have their service mail and applications. And they're really great about making sure they don't have these super large databases for mail files. So they set quotas on their mail files, which is really good, highly recommended. And they're smart enough to know that, okay, if I change my replica, or excuse me, I change my quota on the primary server, I change the quota on the secondary server. So they had this really strange scenario. When users would fail over to the secondary server, the users were actually finding that their quotas were blown. So they said, well, we don't actually understand this. We've looked and we see there's the same number of documents in each database. Can you possibly explain it? So I went ahead and did the analysis. And one of the things I found that was different was the number of deletion stubs. And actually there were thousands and thousands and thousands more deletion stubs in the replicas that were on the secondary server. The critical thing to understand here is that purge operation happens on database open. So the deletion stubs were remaining in those databases much, much longer because the databases were not being open. Now, one of the critical things to understand is this is actually taken care of for us in Domino 9 and 901 through the DBMT, or the database maintenance tool. So this is something you would see in prior to a release 9 scenario. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Ben, and he's going to talk about how to locate the deletion stubs.
All right, thank you, Kim. So as far as locating deletion stubs, this is where it gets a little tricky, because the thing is, deletion stubs are not displayed in views. They are not, in fact, document class nodes. They have a different node class, which means that there is no way to really get to them unless you use some sort of coding. Now, when there is a pretty interesting tip that I found when we were preparing this presentation about a year and a half ago, is when you use the get document by unique ID in LitterScript, the object that is returned by a deletion stub will actually raise an error if you treat it as if it was a document, right? So what we usually do as developers is that we do a protection using the is nothing, but the thing is this is not going to be enough in case of deletion stubs, because there is going to be a handle to something, but that something is not going to be a document. So it is advised to use the test document.size, well, the size property, and make sure that it's 0. And in that case, have some sort of error handling in case we are dealing with some deletions of documents. And the cool thing about this is that I found this topic in a couple forums on the internet. That was actually my favorite comment when it came to this problem. So apparently, this is something that not everybody is aware of. Now, as far as locating deletion stubs, because the thing is, deletion stubs are extremely useful, especially when it comes to understanding what are the differences between databases. This is where you can definitely use ScanEasy, and I do not even feel bad about advertising ScanEasy here, because this is in the free version. So you just download it, and it runs no strings attached. So we're going to show you all of the deletion stubs in a database, along with all of the information that they contain, including the unique ID, which is going to be the same, right? So you can locate that document in a restored version, for example. And I believe that, yeah, I'm just passing it back to you to talk about how to remove them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. So how do you actually remove them? Well, if you want to do a brute force removal, one of the things you can do, again, going into your replication settings and going into your space savers, where we had the number of days to keep the documents not modified, and that would contain the number of deletion stubs, set that to 0, and then close the database and open it back up again. And doing that process will actually remove every single deletion stub from that particular database. So it's not selective. You're removing all of them. A couple of tricks that I want to point out there with this is, as soon as you do that, you set it to 0, you close the database, you open it, the first thing you do is you go back in and you set it back to the value it was, because you don't want to leave it at 0. You could cause yourself a lot of trouble that way. The other trick is, whatever you do not put a check mark next to remove documents not modified in the last X days, because in that case, if you set it to 0, it would go ahead and would delete not only the deletion stubs, but also delete, but it would also delete every single document in that database. Certainly not something you want to do. And again, keep in mind that if you're in release 9, that DBMT will help you with this automatic purging for you. If you want to do it programmatically, you would actually have to do it through the C API, or if you wanted to be selective and go in selectively and select which range of deletion stubs you'd like to remove, you can actually do that through the ScanEasy product. So let's go ahead and recap a little bit about how documents are compared. Obviously, what's really critical is that replication history. And when replication happens, it's not just a replication history, but looking at all of the different properties that Ben has already talked about. So obviously, when two documents are compared, it's going to look, if there is replication history present, it's going to look at what happened, what's changed since the last time we talked. If there's no replication history, it's going to go ahead and it's going to replicate all of the documents, again, a cleaner replication. So you may be wondering, well, what would happen if I actually want to do a mock, do an audit, so to speak, and see what would actually happen if I simulated a replication? This is actually one of the most powerful tools that we use when we're working with customers, and it's wonderful when they actually have the Ytria tools, because we can use ScanEasy and use the replication auditor. And this is just an example of what it looks like. It's an absolutely powerful tool. So you can see in the left column, it's showing the particular database that's open on ASME01, and it's going to replicate, or you're going to simulate a replication with the same database on server ASME02. And you can see what would end up happening. So you can see if we actually replicated these databases, we'd end up with 8 conflicts. And we have a scenario. Remember, we talked about making sure if you have readers fields that the servers are appropriately listed in those fields. In this case, we have a situation where one document does not have ASME01 in its readers field. So that document is not going to be able to be replicated from ASME02 replica over to the replica on ASME01. We can see we have 12,047 documents that are going to be, or 1,247 documents that are going to be created, and you see that 105 pull updates are going to happen, and you can see they're actually going to be pushed over from the replica sitting on ASME02 over to ASME01. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ben, and he's going to take us through a lot of scenarios of how we actually start comparing documents.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Actually, I would like to mention a few different scenarios as far as what happens when we compare documents. This tool that we did here, the Replication Auditor tool, the idea is that we essentially compare these documents and follow the same logic that the replicator engine would follow. And in that sense, we have three different very important scenarios to look at here. We're going to look at when we've got two design notes or deletion stubs that both exist in both replicas and are being compared. So what is it that is taken into consideration there? And there's a couple of interesting things about that. Then we're going to move on to the next scenario where we're talking about documents or profile documents that are being compared. And we're going to wrap it up with the scenario where the note, whether that's a document or design or anything in a notes database, exists in one of the replicas but does not exist in the other replica, or is a deletion stub in the other replica. So what happens then? So let's get started with when we are talking about design notes or deletion stubs that exist in both the replicas. Now, the interesting thing to know about this is that the replicator engine is going to first look at the sequence number and the initial modification time, which will decide which node is going to win. Now, what's very interesting about this to know is that when we compare two designs, say you've got two views and two replicas, and one of them has a sequence number of 5, the other one has a sequence number of 3, the one with the larger sequence number is going to win and no questions asked. Why this is important is this actually follows an interesting logic. It's different from documents being compared. So what this means in reality is that if you have developers working on two different replicas and working with the same designs, the one who's using Control S the more is going to win replication, and there is no conflict for design elements or deletion stubs for that matter. So that is scenario number 1 and one thing to watch out for. Scenario number 2 is when we're talking about documents or profiles, and this is slightly more complex, well, thankfully, right, because we do not want to lose what we're working on. So what happens here when we are comparing two documents or two profile documents is the sequence number is the first thing that's going to be compared, and basically if it is the same, then we're going to look at whether the initial modification dates are the same. If they are the same, so both the modification dates for these documents and their sequence numbers are the same, then there's nothing to replicate. If the sequence numbers are the same but modification dates are not, then we either do an update or there's going to be a possible conflict according to what conflict handling options you set up on your form. Now, what gets really interesting here is when the sequence numbers are not the same, because then what's going to happen is we need to decide what the last synchronization date was for these documents by looking into the Delta revisions field on both documents. And as a result, we're going to either create a conflict or just do a simple update. So this is one thing we need to look at from a bit closer. In the first scenario, we are looking at two documents. One of them has sequence number 4, the other one has sequence number 3. And what needs to be done is we need to find the last synchronization date. So basically, we're looking for the last most recent dates that are present in both of these revisions items. As we see here, we actually found them, and we can see that ever since these two documents were the exact same, it was only document A that was updated, and this is why it has a higher sequence number. So the result in this particular scenario is going to be that document A is going to update document B. Now, the next scenario is where we will find that the document that has sequence number 4 has been updated 2 times ever since these two documents were the same, and document B was also updated once ever since they were the same. This is the scenario where we're actually going to create a conflict, right? And A is going to be coming out as the winner because it has the most recent modification date here. So this is a scenario where there's going to be a conflict, or of course depending on your conflict handling options, because you may as well choose to automatically merge those conflicts or just keep the winner, which is kind of a suicide, by the way. So these are very important scenarios when it comes to document comparison. And then what happens if the note either does not exist in one of those databases or is a deletion stub in one of the databases? Well, two pretty simple scenarios actually. But one thing to watch out for, if the document or design that we're about to replicate does not exist in the other database at all, then it's going to be created. In case this is a deletion stub that does not exist in the other database, there's going to be a silent creation, because this is not a document or a design class node, but it's still going to be created in the backend. The second, and that's probably more interesting scenario, is when we've got a document that is a deletion stub in the other replica. So what happens then? As we said, when documents are created, they're turned into these light placeholders, right? But the unique ID is going to be the same. So what happens when we compare a deletion stub and a document that have the same unique ID? We would say that deletion stubs win, right? Because that's what they're there for. But this is not always the case. Because in a case, say a document is deleted in replica B, and before replica A and B would replicate with each other, the same document is updated like 3 times in replica A. In this case, the actual document will have a higher sequence number than the deletion stub, and the document is going to win replication and come back from the dead. Okay? So the thing is, when you delete something and a deletion stub is created, the deletion stub will be 1 or 2 numbers higher in its sequence number than the initial document. But if you do not replicate frequently enough, you're going to run a chance that the document comes back. So this is something that we were very surprised to find. All right, so this is the comparison, comparing documents and design notes part. Now, let's move on to something else and take a look at what can go wrong. We are going to focus on 2 different very important scenarios and all of their aspects here. We are going to get started with the replication and save conflicts. So I'm going to pass it back to Kim, and then we're going to talk about ghost documents. So stay tuned for more. All right.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So basically, we have to differentiate what is a save conflict, what is a replication conflict, because they are slightly different, quite different actually, but we still end up with a conflict. What a save conflict is if 2 or more people are editing the exact same document at the exact same time, and the key here is in the same replica. So that's a save conflict. A replication conflict is when 2 or more people are editing the same document in different replicas, and it's between replications. And what ends up happening here is you end up with a conflict document. And you have a conflict. The conflict is actually the loser. So whatever one is the winner is our parent document. That's it looks, from a view perspective, it looks like the normal one. And then we have our response document or documents. And how we know these are actually conflict documents, you can see that they have a $ref item actually appended to them, and they also contain a $conflict item. So if we take a look at what do we actually do? So what can we actually do to go ahead and prevent these? What do I do? How do I find them? What's the best way to sell them? So we'll go ahead and we'll look at some of the different scenarios here. One of the best things, obviously, to do is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So one of the best things to do is actually prevent them from happening. And one of the things you can do is actually just add in an authors field, and then you're limiting the number of people that actually can edit that document. Obviously, if you're limiting the number of editors, then you're going to be reducing your possibility of creating conflicts. The other thing that you can look at as far as preventing save conflicts is look at using the document locking feature, which has been in the Domino product for quite a long while, and look very closely in your Lotus script code. Make sure that you're limiting where you're using compete with form, because that can create a lot of save conflicts. And then the really critical thing is if you're actually doing a document save in your query save and post save events, and you're actually not closing the form out, but you're leaving it open, that can create a lot of save conflicts. So look at those techniques. As far as preventing replication conflicts, one of the big things is look at where your scheduled agents are going to be running. Do you want them running on all your servers that happen to be in your cluster made, or do you want them running just on your primary server? Typically, that's what you want. This is a great place where you can actually use the Ytria Agent Easy product. You can find out where those databases are, where those agents are set to run on, and you can just change their properties there. Or another really good option, you can go out and look at the agent aggregator code that Thomas Lindberg has created that will let you specify and basically run some pre-code to say, I only want the agent running on this server when it's actually up and active, when it's the primary server. I only want it running on this my secondary server during a failure situation. The other things to look at is if you're not replicating often enough, consider clustering the servers, because then you're going to have your in-memory cluster replication happening, your streaming cluster replication. That's going to help prevent those. Obviously, keeping the number of replicas to a minimum, not having multiple replicas on the same server. And then the last thing that's really, really critical as far as preventing replication conflicts is don't do a lot of mass updating of your documents, or certainly if you need to do that, don't do that when your users are active in them at the same time. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ben, and he's going to go ahead and give you an example related to conflict documents.
Yeah, thank you. So just very, very quickly, because we're kind of running out of time, this was a very interesting scenario that I ran onto when I was at a customer site. We've got a product that is actually a ScanEasy, that is a document management tool that comes with an embedded conflict solver. And one of the features of this tool inside ScanEasy is the ability to list all of the conflict documents in a database. And I have to admit that I like using this product on names and address books at customer sites, because there's always some nasty troubles in there. So I go into this customer and I open ScanEasy, and we found like 15 conflict documents. And I tell them, look, there's a lot of conflict documents in your NAB. And then he looks at me and he says, no, there isn't. And then I'm like, yes, there is. Those are those good documents. And he's like, okay, so show me where they are. And we looked at it closer with ScanEasy, and we found out that those were actually connections documents. And we go into the connections view, and there's nothing in there. I have to admit, I started sweating a little bit. But then I had this idea to look at the view selection formulas. And what we found, actually, we've got this ViewEasy product that will let me go through all the view selection formulas and analyze them. What we found was that 61 out of the 104 standard views in the 853 NAB are set to hide conflict documents. So this is kind of a double-edged sword, because it's kind of a feature, but it also makes it kind of hard to really oversee these conflicts, because conflicts will need some actions to resolve them. So why would people want to hide conflicts? Because what you want to watch out for is that you do not want your users to edit conflict documents. What happens when a user goes into an actual conflict document, so we're talking about the document that has the $conflict item on it, and they save it, the $conflict item is going to be lost, and you will not work with conflicts anymore, but you're going to end up with duplicates that are much harder to manage. So in order to prevent users from editing those conflict documents, what you can do is either hide them from views, but you want to make sure that you have a way to find conflict documents in databases, find and resolve, or you can use something like this code right here that is ideally placed into the query mode change event, so that it will check for the presence of a $conflict item before it allows users to edit document, and it's going to just prevent them from putting this document into an edit mode before you resolve that conflict. So this is just a few tips as far as hiding them from users, and let's take a look at what's the best way to solve conflicts.
Great. Okay, it's easy, right? You just delete them. Not a problem at all. Well, actually, no, that's not what we really want to do. We actually have three scenarios that we want to take a look at here. One is if the winner document contains all the necessary information. The second one is if the conflict actually contains all the necessary information. In the third scenario, which unfortunately tends to be the more common one, what if both of them contain some information? So let's go ahead and take a look at what we'll actually do in the scenario where if the parent, actually the winner document, the parent document contains everything. In this case, we see, obviously our conflict has our $ref and $conflict items. In this case, this is the best case scenario. And this we're able to do is we're actually able to just delete that conflict document and completely remove it. We just have our parent remaining. So that's our best case scenario. So our next scenario is what if the loser contains all the necessary information? In this case, we don't want to delete this parent document. I've seen this happen a number of times. And when I see that being pressed in a meeting and the customer doesn't understand and they press the delete key, it's like, no, you just created an orphan. Now we have to go locate that document and we have to, get it back. So basically what you want to do in this case, you want to keep your conflict. You want to get rid of your parent. We can't just delete our parent. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and go out and remove the two references. We need to remove those two items. We need to remove the $ref and the $conflict. And at that point in time, that document is no longer considered a conflict document, and then it is safe to delete the parent. If you're looking for some script, some loaded script code, you go out to breakingpower.com and you can find that script that will actually help you to show you exactly how you need to do that, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So let's take a look at the third scenario, In this case, this unfortunately tends to be the more common scenario. So you end up with a situation where both of these have some information that you want. So you actually need to get into a situation where I have to go and compare each document. This can be a lot of work, depending on how, especially depending on the number of replication or save conflicts that you have. You actually have to go in and look at every single document, look at all of the item values, and determine which ones are different and which ones do you want to merge. In this case, you're going to be merging those changes into your parent document. To be honest, the best solution in the industry really is ScanEasy. We're not trying to put a plug in here. It works so magically well. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. This is looking at the conflict solver, which is part of ScanEasy. It's actually one of my more favorite parts of ScanEasy. It's kind of hard to say that because ScanEasy has so many different cool features and functions, but you can see how powerful this is. And if you had multiple conflicts, so let's say you had 5 conflicts, you would actually be able to look at all of them along with the parent at the same time. What I like to do is select the check mark to show only the fields with different values. And this gets right down to the detail level very, very quickly of which are the item values that are different in each one of your documents. And literally you just click, I want these 2 to win from the parent document, and I want these 4 to win from the conflict document. Click the solve button, and you're off and running. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ben, and he's going to go ahead and talk about ghost documents.
All right, thank you. And the thing is, when it comes to ghost documents, this is not really an official naming convention or something. We like to call them ghost documents, and there's multiple scenarios that are possible that can both happen when it comes to replication. There's replication ghost and there is resurrected ghost documents. We're actually going to go ahead and skip the first one here and just focus on the resurrected ghost documents part so that we can keep our time here. This is a scenario that we run into a lot of times, and whenever we did this presentation and asked for a show of hands of who ran into this situation, it's usually more than half the room who already had to deal with something like this. So basically the scenario is simple. This is an actual customer scenario, so these guys were not even customers, they were prospects actually. So what happened is they leave the office the night before, and there's an internationally replicating database that has about 60,000 documents replicating across 300 servers, okay? And when the next day that they come back, they all of a sudden have 75,000 documents in there. Well, that's when you start the day knowing that it's not going to be a good one, right? So that's when they started looking around and basically found us up. So what we did is we went in there with ScanEasy, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, but essentially what turned out to be the issue is that there was a user somewhere who had a replica locally which has not replicated with the production database since a very long time. Now, in the meantime, the production database is very heavily used. You can guess 300 servers. That's a lot of people using it. And a lot of documents are deleted in the meantime. But the thing is, the standard deletion stub lifetime setting is about 90 days, which means if you do not replicate a database for, say, about 4 or 5 months, and then all of a sudden you start replicating again, you're going to have a whole bunch of documents that have been removed from the production database, and not even the deletion stubs are there to tell that local replica that these documents are not belonging to this database because they're old. And this is where those documents come back as if they were new. So essentially, what you can do is, so this is, I just forget about this one. So what is it that we can do? What if it already happened? Basically, this is where we get back to what we already talked about. That is the initial creation and the created and defined dates. What we do in our product, because we've got ScanEasy that has a tool for this called the post-replication auditor that immediately finds these documents. Actually, that's what we did with this customer. We went in there, gave them a free license key, they found them, removed all the documents. Turns out it was not the best decision business-wise because they never purchased the tool, but it took 1 hour to get rid of this situation, right? So what we do in here is we're going to look at the initial creation, aka the birth date of this document, and we're going to look at the created and defined date, which will tell us when it was replicated into this database. And we take the difference between those 2 dates, and if that difference is bigger than the deletion stub lifetime, then we're running the risk of these documents actually being ghost documents. The equation is a little bit more complex than that because we also need to take into consideration the creation date of that database, but this is the basics. Now, there is actually a project on an OpenNTF that you can look up. Actually, I think it's in the initial slide deck. That will do pretty much the same thing, but you need to stamp those documents because getting the edit in this find date is something very tricky, and as we discussed, that only works through the API. So this here is what the post-replication auditor looks like. So this is how you find all of the possible resurrection documents in there, and you can just go ahead and delete them right away. Now, let's move on to some happy thoughts, shall we? Talk about how we prevent this, because this is kind of a nag, this problem. How do we prevent them, Kim?
Actually, the way we prevent them is a new feature that was added in Release 853 called PIRC, or Purge Interval Replication Control. This is something, if you do not have it enabled, I recommend you go and enable it as quickly as you possibly can. What this does is it prevents a scenario where those old documents and old deletion stubs you prevent them from actually replicating into the database. So by setting this up, you're protecting yourself from the exact scenario that Ben just talked about. The way that you set this is actually going into your replication settings, and it's on a per database level. So this is each individual database you have to do this on. It's not just set it to one database and it'll replicate over to your other databases. It's a per database level. So you can go into your Space Savers tab and just select the option to enable Purge Interval Replication Control, and you can see that it automatically tells you it's going to prevent any modified documents and deletion stubs being replicated into this database before this specific date and time, which obviously is going to be calculated based on how many days you have set as far as the number of the days of your deletion stubs that can be in there. Now, the critical thing to understand is make sure that you have all of your documents properly replicated before you enable this. So if you're in a situation where you have a new server, let's say you bring in a new server and you add a new server to your cluster and you replicate your databases over, make sure that you pass in on the replication the -no PIRC switch, because that'll make sure that every single one of the documents replicates in versus just a subset of the documents. But this is something extremely powerful, definitely something you want to use. So let's go ahead and take a look at a customer example. This actually happened last May. It was new, just getting into at the beginning of a conference. It was like, oh wow, we've got a big one that just came in. In this particular case, this customer, they had one of their primary applications. They called and they said, hey, this is a really horrible problem. We don't even begin to understand how this happened. We all of a sudden, just overnight, we have over 34,000 documents that just reappeared. And they were deleted months ago. How in the world could this happen? We have PIRC enabled on all of our servers, and they have 3 servers in their cluster. We started doing an investigation, and what we actually found is that when the primary server was moved over to a new box, they basically did it through, instead of doing a drop and replace, they built a new server and then used admin P to create the new replicas. Once all the replicas are created, then they down their server on the old box and rename the server on the new box. So that's basically how the server was moved. Because those databases were created via admin P, again, that setting, the PIRC setting, does not replicate. So what ended up happening, even though the databases had initially been all PIRC enabled on all 3 of their servers, with the way that the new server was set up and the server was moved to, those databases are no longer PIRC enabled. And what ended up happening is they had run like this for a number of months. And luckily, nothing had happened, but they ended up with a scenario where one of their users connected into their Citrix environment, and they hadn't replicated for months and months and months, obviously, from the Citrix environment. Because that database was not PIRC enabled, they ended up with this scenario. So the critical thing to take away here is double check and make sure that those databases are PIRC enabled. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and he's going to go ahead and wrap things up.
All right. So before we move on to the Q&A section, actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about this replication easy tool, because we wanted to make sure that we cover as much technical detail as possible in this presentation. We do have a tool, actually multiple tools, that will help you with all of this kind of replication problems as far as investigations and understanding how replication went go. We would love to show this to you. We did not want to do this in this presentation, but we're going to do a follow-up webinar that you'll be able to sign up for. Replication Easy, this product that we're going to talk about in that webinar, is going to be the multi-server product that will help you oversee your entire domain, multiple servers, to understand what has been replicated and where, how replication happened. It has embedded features to better understand your replication topology, how it actually happened, find inconsistencies, like document-level inconsistencies, find any replicas where documents are missing, and you can also understand why as well as resolve why that is happening. So we've got a whole bunch of features in here that we'd love to show you. So we're going to do this webinar later on. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure to send out an email to all of you with the recorded webcast link as well as the slide deck information. And in this link, you're going to find the registration links to these events that we're going to do about Replication Easy. So with that, I am going to turn it back to Howard so that we can take a look at some of the questions here.
Okay, thanks, Ben and Kim. That was a great presentation. I think I've been doing Notes and Dominoes stuff for about 20 years, and I learned something. So, so thank you both for being the presenters. We have a number of questions queued up. Ben, if you could switch presentation over to me. I'll explain again how to ask a question.
I'm sorry, I'm working on that.
No problem.
Okay, there we go. Should have it by now. There you go.
It's coming. Okay, so you should be seeing the screen in a second that shows how to ask a question. So what you want to do at the top of your screen is the WebEx ribbon menu, and one of those menu options is Q&A. And if you don't see it on the top, use the drop-down arrow to the right, the little arrow, and you'll see the Q&A option, and that will give you this panel that you see on the screen here, where my mouse pointer is, and you can ask a question, ask it of all panelists, and Rob and I will then verbally ask your question to Ben and Kim. Rob, I think you have a question queued up.
Sure. Thanks, Howard. There's a couple questions kind of related to the readers field. From Pablo and Allard. Basically, what happens with deletion stubs using readers fields, and specifically from Pablo, if a server is in a role that's included in a readers field, does that work too?
Yep, I'll take those. For the first question, as far as servers with role assignment and role assignments in readers fields, that is going to work. So that's a yes. As far as deletion stubs using readers fields, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, because the thing is, deletion stubs only contain a very small amount of items, actually not even items, but information on them, including the unique ID when they were deleted. One of the questions we always get is there a way to find out who was the one deleting those initial documents, right? But we cannot tell that because that is not contained within the deletion stub. And I mean, on deletion stubs, you will not find any readers items. So that is not 100% clear to me.
Hey, Ben, and a follow-up on that is, do you know if there's a way to clear out the deletion stubs via loaded script?
Yeah, that is, as far as I know, there isn't, not via loaded script or some existing functions in loaded script. You have to do a C API call from within loaded script. This is something that comes back to what we mentioned as far as grabbing a document based on its unique ID and trying to manage it as if it was a document. Basically, if you try to remove the document using the delete or remove document method, you're going to run onto an error if it's a deletion stub. So it is not going to go through directly loaded script. You have to either use ScanEasy or you can go through the C API.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Got a question from Mark, and Mark's scenario is he wants to make a replica copy of a database to do some testing on, and then wants to be able to reset the replica ID. So is there a way to reset the replica ID?
Actually, yes, and there's multiple ways you could do that. Obviously, if you have the Ytria tools, you can use ScanEasy, and actually you don't even have to purchase the tool. ScanEasy Lite will allow you to do this. So this is, I would highly recommend using this. It's very, very simple. You literally just load the database in ScanEasy, and then you just go down and you can either put in your own replica ID, or you can just say generate a new one. And then as soon as you're ready to turn that database back into your production database, you just go and you open your database that has the replica ID you want to use, you do a copy, and then you just go in and update through ScanEasy, and you just say, hey, this is the replica ID of this database now. So that would be probably the best bet. I know there's some other utilities out there you can use as well, but ScanEasy Lite that you don't even have to pay for, it works. Yes, yep, exactly. Yep, yep. It's a free version. So that's really what I would recommend. It's super easy to use.
Okay, thanks. And then a follow-on to that, I guess if the replica ID is changed, will the doc links and the unit still work, UNIDs?
The thing is, yeah, so if you change the replica ID, that will not modify unique IDs. So whenever you change it back to the initial replica ID, replication is still going to work. As far as document links, that is a very good question. I'd say it depends. That is something to actually test. Yeah, that's something to test because I believe it might be inside the document link physically. I mean, I'm talking about a replica ID, and if the replica ID is changed, then I believe it may actually not work. But this is something we're going to look into.
I'm quite certain that's the case because the replica ID is a database setting, so it's not going to affect the UNID because that's, again, the document's unique identifier across all replicas. But those doc links I believe they would be breaking because it is going to contain
I think that the doc links have a server hint with the replica ID.
With the replica ID, yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, Rob, do you have a question?
Sure. I've got a question from Keith here. He's asking if the field remove documents not modified in the last day's field is enabled. It's the checkbox is checked. Are the documents deleted from just this replica or via replication all other replication partners as well?
Yep, I'll take this one.
And if not, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm looking at it too. The answer to this is that the documents are only going to be deleted from this replica because the trick to know about this one is that when you click, when you put the check mark into that box, all of the documents that match the criteria, say you want to remove every document that is older than 30 days, the way these are going to be removed is that there's not going to be any deletion stubs generated, okay? And when that happens, there's still going to be a replication history entry that is going to stop these documents from replicating back. So the replication history entry is going to act as if it was sort of a curtain, and behind that curtain happen these deletions, and this is actually a pretty good solution if you want to keep some replicas somewhere where you want to limit the amount of documents, right, without actually killing all those documents across all of your replicas.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And got a question from Greg. Is there a way to configure an agent to run on a secondary server in a failure scenario?
Actually, one of the things that we...
a little bit beyond application.
Yeah, one of the things that we do is when we work with customers that have clustered environments, what we actually do is we just create a script library that contains code. And again, if you go out to the link that's in the presentation, you can actually find the code that Thomas Lindbergh, I believe, is the individual that has some code out there that you can take a look at. But basically, what you're going to do, what we do, is we create a script library that we put in that we have in a database, and then what we do is in each one of the agents, we include the script library, obviously, and we have it do a check. And basically what the code does is it does a check, and it checks, is the primary server up and active? And if the primary server is up and active, then as the database, as that agent is going to execute, it says, hey, am I running on the primary server? If I am, if the primary server is up and I'm running on the primary server, then I'm allowed to run. if the primary server is up and active and I'm running on the secondary server, I'm not allowed to run. In the scenario where the primary server has gone down, obviously those agents are not even going to be running. And in that case, when the secondary server, when the agent runs on the secondary server, the first thing it checks is who's the primary server. I'm going to check, is it active, is it up and running? And if it ends up, it's up and running, if the secondary server, if the primary server is not up and running, it says, hey, now it's okay for this agent to run. So basically you just have to add the logic in, and it's a pre-check that happens, it's code that runs before each agent actually executes. So you'll have to make some modifications to your agents. But if you go out to the link that's in the presentation, you'll be able to download, you'll be able to find that, the script example.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Rob, you got a question?
Sure. Here's a question from Javier, and it's about notes replication. And he's saying users replicate with every server around the globe because the setting preferred server is set to any available, try last or successful first. So he's wondering if there's any advice to solve this type of problem scenario.
In that case, I mean, that would be something you'd want to go and, so let me just understand. So he's saying that the preferred server is any that's available. Typically in that scenario, that will end up happening is you don't end up with too much of a problem, because what's going to happen is it's going to look and say, well, the last time when any available, try last successful first, it's just going to say, hey, the last time I replicated, what server did I replicate to? And as long as it can actually hit that server, it's okay. If that one doesn't, if it can't hit that one, then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to go to the next server, the next server, the next server until I actually find one. So I don't think there's really going to be too much of a problem with that. That's just a normal setting. Hopefully that answers the question that you have.
Okay. Thanks, Kim. And by the way, we also have two questions on the PERT setting. One is it per database or per replica? And does the user on the local replica have to do anything on their end?
I'll go ahead and take that one. It definitely is a per database setting, because that's actually what ended up happening in that customer scenario that I talked about, where the databases, they were all replicas of each other, but they had set perk up on each individual database. What they did when they actually moved the server to the new physical box, they did, instead of doing the drop and replace, they actually had built a temporary server that they used, and they used admin P to create the replicas of those databases. So those were new replicas of the databases that were created through admin P, but they weren't perk enabled. So it is a per database setting. You need to go into each database and enable that for each individual database. That setting will not replicate across replicas.
Okay, so I think that answers the thing about the end user's local replica. It's going to, is that, or actually, does it matter about the end user, or is it more of a server thing?
It's actually something you definitely want to set it. You want to set it on your server, and it basically, the reason you want to set on the server is it's going to prevent this situation. And this is the example that most people end up running into, is you have somebody has a local local replica of names.nsf, and out of the blue they replicate it, right? And you get all these ghost documents and all these people that you deleted years ago potentially coming back in. And in that case, if you have perk enabled, you really want to enable it on your replicas on the server, because it's a server-based functionality. So it's going to make sure that, you know, regardless of what the local is set to, you're protecting that replica on the server.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Well, I think we are about out of time. Let's, Rob, you have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Here's a question from Ken. He's wondering what would cause the situation where the document count between a pair of clustered servers is different. Replication and cluster replication is working without any errors. So why the difference in the document count?
Well, the thing is, there's multiple scenarios that are possible here. Like, we actually get this a lot with Kim. as far as why replication isn't happening as it's supposed to. My best guess would be, since we're talking about clustered databases, is that what we actually mentioned is that clustering is in-memory replication. So what if one of those servers went down and there is no backup connection documents to make sure that those replicas are in sync? If there was any memory loss for whatever reason, that could actually end up leaving those clusters out of sync. The other thing is, one of the other things is that when it comes to two different replicas and differences between them, so if we're not talking about cluster replicas but standard replicas, one of the things to look at is what happens when you do not have a replication history or any replication history entries in there, because like I said, it's kind of like a curtain, and what's behind that curtain is, for example, documents were removed. That will not be reconsidered unless you remove the replication history for a cleaner replication and thereby make them consistent again. So I believe there's many different possible scenarios. As far as clustering, it's probably a matter of something with the memory replication stuff.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ben. Well, I think we are out of time. It's a couple minutes after 12. I have on the slide, the last slide, we have some upcoming events. Ben mentioned they're going to do a webinar on their tool set, Replication EZ, and that's on May 14th. TLCC, for any developers out there, will be having another X-Pages webinar on May 13th, as well as in June. And then there's a couple live events coming up, one in Europe in June, Selective Connections in Prague. And then for the US folks in August, you start planning ahead for the NW Plug, which is always a great event. If anyone has any questions, the contact information for Ytria and TLCC is also on the last screen. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and also thank Ben and Kim and Rob for helping with this webinar. It was a great webinar for the first time that we've done an admin webinar, and we look forward to helping everyone. Oh, and by the way, I have the wrong phone number on the slide, and we'll correct that in the final slide deck for Ytria. So we'll the updated number will be in the slides that we send out to you. So everyone have a great rest of your day or evening, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone.